Yes, thank you very much for your presentation and the way you answered the questions. We, first person plural, will think further about it. Now we come to the next speaker, Professor Riccardo Prandini, who is a professor of sociology at the University of Bologna. He has studied at that same university, and he was also a fellow of the Forschungskolleg Humanwissenschaften, which is an Institute of Advanced Study in Humanities at the Goethe University in Frankfurt am Main. His main area of research is the sociology of cultural processes and communication. Floor to you.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I am a sociologist, not a sociologist of law. So in a sense I am an outsider, with the distinction inside-outside. And what I can try to do is to observe the debate of societal constitutionalism from the outside. And what I see from the outside is that all the debate is framed into a metaphorology of space, and ask myself what happens if I shift the analysis from a spatial to a temporal perspective. So my point is trying to develop a sort of new way to imagine societal constitutionalism shifting from space to time. Societal constitutionalism is conceived as crossing the political boundaries of the national states and reframe these boundaries in a functional subsystem with constitutions. This methodology is well illustrated by the concept of structural coupling, probably the most used conceptual tool in the debate. And after we will see what changes if we understand the structural coupling from a spatial to a temporal understanding. Structural coupling between politics and law is a connection between two functional subsystems conceived in a sort of spatial way. This conceptual framework brings with it some relevant consequences. The Constitution is represented in three ways. First, as a legal container of a political power, spatial metaphor, a legal container, as originated by an external constituent power from outside to inside, a stock of political will, God, the people, as you like, and as the legal limitation of this political energy into a constituted power. So, if you can see, we have three methodologies of space, from inside to outside, from outside to outside. This passion and imagination find its classical form in the modern semantic of unity between politics and law, that is, in the well-defined national state, Rechtsstaat, or constitutional state. And this is one of the most huge problems for the observation of societal constitutionalism, because what I can see in the debate is the difficulty to differentiate between these 2 points of view that are not yet well differentiated, the political and the legal. But this spatial metaphorology leads us to think constitution as something, as a unity, is very limited as imagination. What is generally called globalization breaks the spatial boundary, unleashes new non-political powers, and triggers the aggregation of new social collectivities, new social subjectivities. The we, for example, well explained by Hans. But the problem is now how much time it takes to constitute a we, and how much time is good to remain in the we. To do what? The debate on societal constitutionalism reacts reconsidering the emergence and structuration of new boundaries. Concept of constitutive and limitative function of the social constitution are clearly embedded in this spatial metaphorology. The basic terminology adopted in the debate is rooted on international law, transnational law, legal regime, global normative orders, relationship with human rights, conceived as environmental irritation, etc. Again, crossing boundaries or reaching the environment. This spatial metaphorology is capable of capturing many relevant issues and problems, but it also runs the risk to limit our sociological imagination. Above all, it focuses the attention of scientific observers mainly on the integrative function of law, its capacity to include parts in a well-defined whole. My modest proposal is to shift the attention to the temporal side of the problem and to understand in this new methodology, if this new methodology could help us to clarify important issues kept into latency up to now. This proposal is founded on two basic points. First, the basic function of law is to bind time, Zeitbindung, to maintain and stabilize normative expectation even if they are disappointed. The normative expectations link the present, that is the only time we have, with the projection of future expectation as to what will be socially approved. So my first point is that the function of law is to be understood in this temporal way. This is, of course, the argumentation of Nicholas. The second point is that the evolution of society drives rapidly toward the so-called temporalization of complexity and towards the tyranny of presumptive consequences of decision-making. So we have to make this two shift to focus our attention on the temporal function, time binding of law, and to embed this new observation inside the temporalization of complexity. And of course, I will not be able to show you the consequences of what means the temporalization of complexity, because I don't have neither the language skill, but this changes everything. There is an intensification in the distinction between the present's future and the future's present. The present in the future and the future in the present. Law cannot be stable over time in the sense that what is valid once is valid forever. This is the temporalization of validity of law. And I think that if we want to understand better, or in a different way, the problem of societal constitutionalism, we have to take this point of view. At the same time, it becomes increasingly difficult to ask for legitimacy in the sense of collective decision-making, guided by constant values and principles. So we have the double problem. From the point of view of legality, legality is temporalized, and from the point of view of the political system in an abstract sense, not as a state, but as every political system of every organization, a family as a political system, in a sense, the church as a political system, that is to say, the organization that have to make collective decisions. So we have the double problem, from the point of view of validity of law and from the point of view of legitimacy. If you can secure the future in the present, that is possible, quite possible, you can secure the future in the present, it is not sure that you can determine the present in the future. Modern society must operate without a certain future. That is, it must operate with growing risks. The concept of temporalization of complexity means that, this is a quotation from Luhmann, very important, very relevant. The definitions in relation to persons and space are in many respects replaced by definitions in relation to time. We can think, for example, to the definition of social identity. We cannot understand the formation of social identities, of a we collective identities, without this reference to time. Or the family, what is a family, what is the family today, what will be tomorrow, etc., etc. What else you want to observe. The law itself, second point, is more and more temporalized. That is why the new basic problem with law is the temporalization of its validity. So at the end of the day, we can resume this argumentation with this statement. What remains is the replacement of the known past with the unknown future as a constant, continuously operating premise. What remains is the ongoing creation of contingency as stable eigenvalue, as recursively renewed values of the legal system. Under these circumstances, and in these terms, self-description have to be found we can still deliver. What does it mean for the debate on constitutionalism? I select here only 5 issues that we can, this is my effort, this is my opinion, we can understand better if we re-entry time into the analysis. First point, emerging temporalized issue. First point, the preference to use the term constitutionalization instead of constitution. This is one of the first points. In the debate, you will find this term constitutionalization without constitution, something that is a process that doesn't have to finish with a constitution, and this is very important. I have a question if it is possible of thinking about constitutionalization without constitutions. Second point, the growing uselessness of maintaining the temporal and social distinction between constituting power and constituted power. And the preference for the paradoxical concept of already constituted powers as constituent builders of new temporary political structures. This is one of the issues of the papers of Chris Thorigan. The crossing and the vanishing of the distinction between constituting and constituted. What is constituting is something already constituted in time, and what is really important is not the before and after, but the process itself, that auto-legitimize itself without external references. Third point, the increasingly importance of courts, national, international, and jurisdiction compared with the diminishing relevance of parliaments and legislation. This is a complete changement in the perception of constitution, shifting from political power that constitutes itself with law towards legal powers that constitute themselves with the help of temporary policies. Temporary policies. 4. The mounting prominence of judicial proceeding, time delays, and the improvement of open space of participation in order to manage the necessity to decide in an uncertain and risky present. This is another huge issue in the debate, the growing importance of proceeding and procedure time delays. Think, for example, to the famous round in the WTO, it takes a lot of years. To take time, not to decide in the present, but to delay the decision, and in the meanwhile, to constitute and to operate as if there is something already constituted. Sort of fiction. But we have to take that. It's the opposite of courts. Courts have to work rapidly, have to respond with decision. Participation is used in delaying decision for constructing consensus. Democratic or not is another problem. But probably democracy is now only to open access in time and space to people and to bring them into the system and to ask him to maintain what they have said in the procedure. So you, in a sense, link yourself to a procedure, and it's in the same time you are linked, captured by the procedure itself. Fifth point, the more and more fundamental function of human rights in the process of global constitutionalization conceived as a transcendent formula of contingency, a stop rule contrasting normatively the uncontrollable releasing of new and unexpected social powers. Human rights is another form of time shaping. This is to say, if everything is possible, if everything is contingent, so we have to maintain something unconditional, that is something that you can change in the future, that is human right. You cannot touch humanity against the law, and you cannot touch humanity using the law. So if I hope I show you all this temporal shaping of constitutionalism. How many? What do you need? 10 minutes. 10 minutes. Okay. So, before trying to make myself more clear, I want to underline two huge questions for the future. I don't want to argument now because are very huge questions. First, the problem of deformalization of law by its impossible futurization. This is one of the dangers I can see with the temporalization of complexity. The mechanism for variation of law becomes circularly supercharged with self-produced conflict. So in a sense, if you take the system theory, variation and selection are overimposed on stabilization. So you have to produce in the present law, but you cannot stabilize law, or you cannot think that this law will be the same law tomorrow. This is interesting. For Constitution too, because Constitution is seen as the basic law. Legal change becomes normal, and the average period of norms validity decreases, coming closer to a self-contradictory minimum length. This process leads to lose the legitimacy and reliability of law for all the other social subsystems and for the society as a whole. So this is my first huge problem. We are going to a time, to a future when it will be more and more difficult to stabilize law, but we will have more and more the necessity to have law. So this is a very important point. I cannot argument with my quasi-English, with my personal, heroic language, but here we have the problem of the crossing between law and law and law, the oscillating between law and law and law that you discussed a moment ago. Constitution remain necessary but increasingly improbable. Law cannot guarantee security if society itself sees its future as a risk which is contingent on decision making. This is a structural changement that I think is really important for the debate. And this leads, but I don't have time, to the tyranny of the presumptive consequences of decision making. And this leads to what Niklas Luhmann once called the problem of the future that cannot begin. You have to decide, but you cannot decide. Because if you decide, you stop your future, and the future cannot begin. We have to live in a general abstinence from principle. And this point is really important because this complexification of law leads to observe in a simple way that you can operate in a legal way, but at the same time you can choose to operate outside the legal system. You can do a lot of things more rapidly without entering in the legal system. Without entering in the legal system. We have, Saskia Sassen gives us some example, but we have a lot of examples of this. We in Italy, do you understand that we in Italy, we cannot, really it's not a joke. If we operate inside the legal system, Italy crashed down immediately. So this is an interesting point. Second point is what I call the virtualization of the global constitutionalism. Maybe the future of law system, guided by a huge production of rights, will develop as a virtual global social environment made of manifold forms of law to which different individual or collective subjects could connect to operate legally and with political objectives. Here, political means only with the capacity to adopt binding decisions for a collectivity. So the meta-code of constitutionalism could be not inclusion, exclusion, but connection, not connection. If you want, you can connect to this virtual space and time of rights. You can connect to what sort of regimes, of legal regimes you want, but you have to pay something to connect. You use the legal tools that binds you, and you are habilitated to do something other. So again, limiting, you link and you limit yourself, but you are able to do something in the legal way. But probably you can choose to disconnect yourself. If you have the freedom, the liberty to choose, you are included in this world. If you don't have the liberty, the freedom to choose, if to connect or disconnect, you are excluded. And this could be interesting, but I'm not an expert of this kind of law, for example, for cyber law, or for what is called high spending technology, that is to say, payments that are made so rapidly that law probably cannot intercept the payment itself. So now I would like to explain better and to work out, for example, to elaborate the central concept of societal constitutionalism, that is structural copings. Of course, I don't have the time. So what I want only to underline is structural coping is not the coupling between two events. Is not operative coping. It's not operative coping. We have not to conflate operative coping to structural coping. Structural coping means that the linking between two subsystems must have a duration, must endure. So again, my question is if this duration is not yet possible, what we have to reconsider constitutionalism. If the validity of law, if the rapidity of the operation outside law is so strong, what kind of duration of enduring couplings we can imagine. Okay. The other point was about of the paper was about desynchronization. Subsystems with structural coupling or not live in a synchronicity. That is to say, that time is the same for all the subsystems. But this is not to say that they live in synchronization. So the other point is to show you as the temporalization of complexity leads us towards a desynchronized society, where system elaborates internally different time horizons with different goals, with different problems, and it is more and more difficult to link and to synchronize this subsystem. Think, for example, of the problem of Greece and economy and politics today. Two different time horizons, quite impossible to link these two time horizons. Or think about what could happen if polytheism, new values commitment enter in a strong way into constitutionalization with this strong irritation with this speed velocity, we want to constitutionalize new values, new commitment. The welfare state 20 years, 30 years ago. But now we have not only the problem of welfare state, but the problem of new polytheism, new value commitment that irritates constitution. The last point is about human rights. An example as a self-produced alien values for global constitutionalism is only to show that desynchronization, that different time horizon, that different velocity are only one side of the story. The other side is trying to stop time. Trying to stop time, it is to say with law, trying to maintain expectation in the future, even if these expectations are disappointed. Human rights are another example of this asynchronism between social system and its environment, because we can understand them as a sort of reaction to the negative irreversibility of exclusion with a positive irreversibility of time. That is to say, with the idea that the human dignity is forever. It is temporally irreversible, it is unconditional. So social systems try to manage the future, stopping it, and in this case, in the case of human rights, to say that humanity, you cannot change human dignity, you cannot change the expectation that all people have to be included in social system. I hope it was only a tentative, it was only an effort to shifting the attention, and I can assure you that if you read all the debates of constitutionalism with this new perspective, focusing on time, you will find a lot of interesting things that could help us to make some good use of argumentation. Thank you. I apologize for my strange language. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Questions?
Thank you so much. This is actually very interesting. I like the idea of the dynamic element that you brought in. But I have a question. So, if in fact you're looking at constitutionalism as a kind of multiple simultaneity and multiple contingencies, what was running through my head, so I'll make this very short, what is running through my head is that you have now made it possible for me to justify Kosovo without Serbs.
To justify?
Kosovo without Serbs. To remove them. Your theory makes it possible for me, and I think quite rightly, to whether or not you leave them in the space, you've now made it possible for me to justify as a matter of constitutional theory, under a dynamic view, at least the current reality of a Kosovo without Serbs.
And what's the question?
No, that's right. And is that something that you envision, and is that something that makes sense?
To me, what makes sense is to change the observation from space that is crossing boundaries. All the debates is very, integrated by this methodology. It is very easy to understand why. Starting, for example, with the functional theory, if you want to observe something, you have to indicate something, and so you make a difference between inside and outside. That's very easy. So even with constitutionalism is very easy to observe the changing boundaries with globalization. But what is left is that when you indicate something and you differentiate this from the other side, two things. You use time to differentiate, and you have to cross, to use time again, to pass from identity and otherness. So if you try to apply this idea of crossing not only into a spatial term, but in a temporal way, I think that you can understand better many of, I try to give you 5 issues for the temporalization of constitutionalism. And all the 5 issues, in my opinion, are well understandable if you use not a spatial methodology, but a temporal methodology. Human rights is a sort of condensation of time in the future. The function of courts is the necessity to decide immediately without democracy, without democratic legitimacy, or the democratic legitimacy of courts have to be elaborated outside the courts. No? So here again we have this balance between politics that is not state. Politics is the we, the multi-faced we that are emerging. Could be religious we, could be what you want. They have to maintain an identity in time. I'm taking time because I don't want that you make another question. So it's very easy. So shifting, I think that and again, delay, I don't have time to show you how it's important to delay decision and so on. Chris, I don't want you to.
If you don't want me to,
No.
I understand. Riccardo, thanks very much. It's an extremely interesting paper for me. I have a kind of a methodological question, in a way, in that at one level, the argument works at a very high level of plausibility, but it seems to me to diminish the sociological function of constitutions, and then it constructs constitutions in a highly, extremely, let's say, sociologically evacuated manner. That one could explain these internal semantics of constitutions that you identify in a very different way from a much more sociological perspective. The question of human rights is very interesting. You link this to the function of time binding in constitutions, saying that this stops time internalistically within constitutions. But what would a reversion sociologically to a condition in which there were no human rights actually look like? Human rights prevent, both internalistically and objectively, a collapse of society into an imaginable condition. So I think there's an internal and an external dimension to these semantics that you described that seems to be somewhat diminished in your analysis. I mean, we could give other examples, talk about concepts of human dignity and so on. Of course, these are produced internally, but they also describe adequately or cement adequately a particular condition of society which is not reducible to solely to functions of time binding on your account. It's just perhaps an observation as much as a question, but I wonder whether this is a rather sociologically impoverished way of approaching constitutions. Sorry to be critical.
What?
Sorry to be critical.
That's why I want you to ask me. Impoverished. Tell me, I don't understand well why impoverished, so impoverished.
Because the concepts that you describe, the normative concepts that you describe, have an internal function and an external function.
Yeah.
So there's the external dimension, actually the role that these institutions play or these norms play in cementing a particular condition of society as a whole doesn't come fully into focus in the analysis.
No, I mean, I think that the Constitution have to be observed from inside and outside. For example, this morning you, if I well understood, you tried to observe the new constitutionalism from inside, from self-reproducing law. That is very important. In the introduction, Gunther Teubner, in a sense, makes the opposite. He says that it is important to balance inside and outside to understand the formation of constitution. And if I well understood, now is more important for him the irritation from outside. So my only point is, for example, with human rights, to understand human rights are, in relation to constitution, are very ambiguous, because from the internal point of view is a stop rule. You have to stop. You cannot. It is unconditional. Time is stopped in a sense. From the external point of view, human rights could irritate too much the inner self-reproduction of law. That is to say, they can irritate in the wrong way. And so I will work on it to improve the field, if possible, if I will survive, of course.
There was also a question from don't you think that this term, constitutionalization, and even globalization nowadays are sort of funny. You know, when you wake up in the morning and say, I don't feel good. What do you have? I don't know. I think I have a constitutionalization, something like that. I explain why. I was in a meeting about law enforcement in Madrid, promoted by Europol and Interpol with the collaboration on Spain police. And we were facing the same law problems. Which are these problems? Is the total disruption of the local law. The local law that, in theory, is expression of some values. Because law is an artifact, as a social artifact. We should have in mind that law is expression of some values which represent us. It's impossible that globalization can cover the whole planet and give one law. Is impossible. Because then we have, for example, I don't know, a Chinese delegate, that when you go to say, but this is not fair, the production means that you lose are not fair. We cannot compare with you because we have sort of rights that are really strong. And they said, yes, but it's your fault because it's your government come to us and asking that. So, what I think, my field is sociology, more than law. What do you think? All this common sense, all this research to have something in common can be wrong. And we should keep our identity instead to disgrace our national identity.
Well, I'm not surprised. I'm not, I think that if constitutionalism runs some risk is not a risk of totalization of something, exactly because societal constitutionalism reacts to a defragmentation of society. So I see exactly the opposite. Societal constitutionalism is a way to deal with fragmentation, but is a way to deal with fragmentation that unleashes powers, and so to limit these powers. So I don't see your point. I think that certainly it's not from societal constitutionalism that you can develop a concept of global law for the planet. So you can elaborate many forms of law, very specified inside each, and then collision between these sub-constitutions. So I don't think if I well understood you, what you want to underline is that constitution is not to conflate constitutionalism with the simple juridification of everyday life. It is easy to see that complex society have to elaborate more and more law. But this is not the same to talk about constitutionalism, because constitutionalism is the ruling of the ruling of law. So I think that you want your target is not constitutionalism, but the idea of juridification of everyday life.
There is no constitution now, because we are not free to face the process that you call constitutionalization. The constitutional process doesn't exist anymore.
No, it exists.
I don't think, because you have you have external organization that have moved the point that was the human being, okay, to another point that is a personal, is a private interest.
Yes, this is. Yes, I understand. I don't think we have so much time to go.
No, that's right. There are still
Half an hour,
questions.
2 hours going on. No,
Thank you very much. I found the paper and the inclusion of temporality a very important addition to the way we think about these things. And reflecting on your paper and Hans's notion of illegality and Tassio's question, regulatory fractures, all these things. The statement from Uma about what was how the future cannot begin. I wonder whether the past, however, can be recreated. And in this sense, with these three different things, I've been thinking about your concept of bringing the time into this and asking a question about retroactivity, which in the constitutional sense in law, usually one thinks of as a very unfair kind of thing. However, in our constitutional system, a very strong theory of interpretation these days is originalism. And we are, some justices anyway, are recreating the past as they look to originalism. So for example, this idea of retroactivity, to what extent can change in the law come about as conditions develop through interpretation, and the interpretation of law already there, so regulations that might be dealing with shadow banks, only nobody ever thought that they did. Yet the language is broad enough to, in effect, say, we don't need to make a new law here, we simply need to reinterpret what's already here, to say that in light of changes of globalization and other aspects that might be going on at this time, your activities are no longer legal. I say this both as a comment, but also as a question, just to bring up the idea of temporality, not only the future and the present, but to what extent is the past a player in your concepts of temporality?
Yes, it's just.
Maybe we will take the other question.
Yes.
Well,
It's so easy to me to understand you that if you want to make 3 or 4 questions at the same time, could I? Yes, of course.
Okay, it's a short question. I too found the temporal dimension as a really interesting way into these questions around constitutionalism. I was particularly intrigued by the idea of acceleration, the speeding up, because that speeding up brings very particular problems with it that aren't necessarily those that temporalization of complexity brings as such. And I was thinking in particular how problematic acceleration is for democracy. In a sense, expectations need time to embed. We need time to, for the deliberation to set in. And also, but even if we move further to normativity itself, and questions of legitimacy, because again, acceleration undercuts normativity, holding on to expectations, not being disappointed, especially in situations where, again, I refer to Saskia Sassen's point about regulatory fractures. We talked about cycles of payment where law doesn't have time to intersect. Yeah. So there is a question. It's not just losing legitimacy, but questions where legitimacy, perhaps due to the speed, doesn't even set in as a question.
Any other questions to overwhelm my brain so that I can collapse immediately? This is enough. Oh, thank you so much. Good, if you want, I can sacrifice myself. No, it's not. Okay. Concerning the past, yes, he's a player, of course, that he will be a player, but I don't think that the idea of interpretation based on the past could really help us. When you interpret, you start from the past, but obviously you have to adapt this interpretation to the future. So I don't see really a special role for this player with the past. I fear that past will come only with the phase of originalism. I fear, but it's only fear. The new value is this to take into account when you decide what you think that will happen. So to include provision inside your decision, and this leads you to not to take past in the right place. I think this is my idea. So about the speeding up and democracy, etc. My only answer is that two things. First of all, it is very important always to separate the observation of what happens from the legal point of view and from the political point of view. Not from legal and state, but from the legal and, for example, the collectivity that have to regulate itself. This is the politics of that collectivity. So the first thing is to separate, and then to observe how it is possible to construct in a hurry consensus. And what I can see is that it's not possible, simply. And so what you can do only is to create fiction. Or, I can see two ways. To generate fiction, that is to say, you decide and you let the time pass and you wait for people that accept your decision because time is passing, or that you ask them to participate into the process, and so you link these people, you bind these people to their participation, and then you can construct consensus against the real idea of these people, because they are in the proceeding. So if you participate, at the end of the proceeding, we have to decide something. We are not, yes, we have to find a consensus. So, that's why I think that it's very important that the part of the paper of Chris about this idea of rights that self-produce policies, in a sense, without democracy. The point is, if you have the we, social collectivity, that have time to express their conflict against this fiction. So we could stay here, for example, to trying to understand what is happening in Greece and to understand how they create or not consensus, and they will create consensus because time will pass and they have to take a decision. And that decision is the binding decision for the Greeks. That's enough.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much.